Just the.
What's that? It's over here. Yeah. Except for the. Okay. All right.
Just email address.
Oh, the computer's open. What are you sharing?
Email that you're sending.
They're talking about this new gem that Brooke came out with.
You'll get it later from Slack.
All right. Hi. Thanks again for coming, and this is the main talk of the night. So for those of you who don't know, we printed up shirts last year for Joel, and Dan wanted to make us say 4th annual. I was like, no, we can reuse them every year.
Smart,
Anyway.
smart.
And
it should say nth annual.
damn it. Where were you when we were talking about this? Yeah.
And after they put it out, they broke the templates, they could never print them ever again.
Yeah.
They could do a factory bus sequence or something.
Yeah.
Anyways,
Year plus one.
so
Annual plus one.
we do have some more, but Dan has them. I don't know what sizes, but if you're interested for next year, because Joel seems to like torturing himself.
Did I tell you that I'm expecting a baby this year? That maybe that will be the thing that puts me off.
Maybe you could tie that into a presentation somehow.
I think I probably will.
So, but anyways, I think there are a few shirts left. So if you're interested, reach out to Dan, and hopefully that will be enough pressure for Joel to do it again next year.
There's a lot of pressure.
Yeah. And Joel, most of you know, but works at GitHub. 5th presentation he's done like this, always amazing. We really appreciate it. You're recording this?
I gotta change this setting.
He's taking a selfie.
Don't worry about that.
All right, so I'm just gonna turn it over to Joel.
Cool. Happy New Year. It's awesome to be back for the 5th year in a row. It's really cool to have so many people interested in Ruby in 2023. I was just reading like state of the Ruby stuff, and I was reading some like really optimistic takes, and I think that this group is a good reminder of how Ruby is still alive and well. Love the idea of a conference. So first, I feel like these days you gotta have a disclaimer. I'm gonna talk about some like really shitty stuff that's happened in my life, at least at the beginning, about the fire from last year. I'll be gentle, but I figure I should mention it before I do. So yeah. So this is a picture of my wife and I and our dog from summer of 2020. We bought this awesome house in Louisville, and this is where we're gonna like start our family. And the thing that I think about when I look at this picture is that a lot of us in the industry look like this. People have some money, generally white, and generally don't have a lot to worry about in their life. And I would say that that was definitely how I was when that picture was taken. But as some of you know, that changed a lot. About a year and a half after that picture was taken, my wife and I were in San Diego, and we were throwing fetch with our dog in the ocean and got in the car, and a couple hours later, I got a text message from the Boulder County Sheriff's Office that told me I needed to get out of my house. Thankfully, I was in Arizona, I think at that point, or somewhere along the way, drive back. This was right around, what does it say? 2:53, yes, 2:53. And then luckily for me, I had backup power on my router. So all of my IoT stuff is still working. So this is 10 minutes later. My camera never goes off, and you can see it was going off every minute. And that was because ash was falling from the sky and triggering the motion detector. Wow. And then I also had an air quality meter in my house. And this is 10 minutes later. And it says that, I don't know how much of you guys are into air quality, but my air quality was 833 something per meter cubed. For reference, that number is, I think 900 is the worst level ever observed in Beijing. And this is my office, like at my desk, inside. So that was not a good sign. So that was at what, like 3 o'clock? This is an hour later. This is not my house, but my house is 2 houses down from this one. Downwind, for those of you who knew how the fire went, it was a wind-driven fire. So when I saw this picture, I knew that this is one of the last houses standing in the neighborhood, that mine was probably already. but I never saw any pictures of the house. It wasn't until the following morning that I pulled up in Twitter and searched for Louisville, Colorado, and there was this picture, which is my neighborhood. My house is right there. It was a couple days before you could see it. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't privileged. Life was really a blur. I mean, I remember giving my talk last year and it being like the sobering moment to be like, it was like one normal thing. One memory that really sticks out for me though, is that about 2 weeks after this photo was taken, I was walking my dog near a friend's house where we were living. And I realized that I hadn't walked my dog in 2 weeks. And for those of you who own a dog and like to walk your dog, that's something you do a couple times a day if you are a dog walker. And until that moment for 2 weeks, I hadn't even perceived that I was not walking my dog. Something was going on. I know some other things too. It was really hard for me to focus on things. I obviously was not working at the time, but anyone who's around would tell me I got angry really, really easily, like in people at stores, in traffic, just with friends. But one thing that really stuck out to me though was that like on numerous occasions, technology failed me. Like it may sound silly, but like one of my angriest moments was when I saw one of these because I couldn't do it. I could not solve the CAPTCHA. And that's when I was like, something's broken. I had similar struggles with one password too. Like you guys know using password managers, like try explaining to your parents, try explaining it to me during this time. Like I just could not do it. What I soon learned from someone at the Red Cross was that when you go through a really traumatic period, it can cause brain damage, like real actual brain damage. And what I was seeing was temporary brain damage that had actually occurred because of this trauma. There was also some permanent stuff that we're still trying to figure out. But thankfully, this was not permanent. So really going through this, it really opened my eyes to that privileged life I lived before this all happened. And it really changed the way I view a lot of what I do professionally. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. That's the shitty part. We can talk about dark parts behind. What I'm going to talk about is accessibility, which really has many definitions. And if you think about, what I'm talking about here, accessibility is the concept of whether a product or service can be used by everyone, however they encounter it. Which in this case, it was me as someone going through intense trauma, encountering difficult to use technology. It was not accessible to me. So, in the past, when I thought of accessibility, I was thinking of people in wheelchairs. Like that's when you literally, you could pull up to a parking spot and you see the accessible, marker is a painting of someone in a wheelchair. Like that is the symbol for disabilities. But what I've really learned since then is that disabilities come in so many forms. And there's a really kind of cool framework for describing them that I really like. And it's that disabilities can be situational, they can be temporary, and they can be permanent. So these graphics are great for this. So for example, a permanent touch disability could be having a single arm. A temporary touch disability could be having a broken arm. And a situational touch disability could be holding a baby. It could be carrying those pizza boxes through the door. You have one less arm. A permanent, same thing for hearing. So a permanent hearing disability is deafness. Temporary could be you have an ear infection. And situational could be your bartender working at a bar. So when I couldn't complete a CAPTCHA, what I had was a temporary cognitive disability. You could imagine that a permanent one might be lead poisoning, for example, that can cause decreased IQ and decreased reasoning skills. It might also just be lack of education, low literacy. Those are other examples of permanent cognitive disabilities. I'm not going to get too technical when it comes to what accessibility means. Just know there are a bunch of different definitions for it. These are some acronyms and things you might have heard that refer to it. They don't even all agree with each other, like most standards. But in practice, for the work that we do building websites, what really matters for accessibility is that our applications work with assistive technology. So again, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail there either. What we mainly focus on in my work at GitHub is screen readers, which are basically tools that announce what's going on the screen to someone who can't see, because that's a major disability that inhibits use of technology. So for example, when you're looking at a GitHub profile page and you're using the built-in screen reader to macOS, which is called VoiceOver, these are literally the words that would read out loud to you as you kind of tab through and keyboard navigate it through the page. So to someone who's using a screen reader, they basically just turn whatever you build as a web app into a tree structure. And that tree structure you can actually see now in Chrome as of very recently. I think it's in the past year or so. In the dev tools, it's called the accessibility tree. So this is not exactly the same page. I tried to find the same profile. And this shows kind of the way a screen reader looks at this. So you can imagine it's kind of like navigating an Excel spreadsheet when you can press like enter to go, like one key to go down a row and then another key to go across columns. You use that kind of navigation to navigate the tree as a blind user. So today I'm going to talk about how we're taking this kind of perspective to improve the way GitHub works for people who are using assistive technology like screen readers. I'm going to talk about three kind of main approaches. One is automated scanning, which is something you guys might have heard about. Another one is actually changing the way we build forms, which is a core competency of Rails. Some people would say that's like all Rails is really good at. And a new way of building UI that for those of you who've worked in React might be pretty familiar, but we're calling it preview-driven development, which is like a new way of thinking about UI architecture. Anyways, I'll do a quick intro. My name is Joel. I'm a staff engineer at GitHub. I kind of just float around the company at this point. I don't really have a specific team, but I work on UI related stuff. So right now, my main job is accessibility. So when I share like details of what it's like to work at GitHub, I like to every year, now for 5 years in a row, talk about the scale of our company. In fact, most people find this more interesting than the actual talk. As of December, we now have 4,000 employees. When I first gave this talk, we had 750 5 years ago.
How many engineers do you think?
A little under 2,000, somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000. Yeah, depending on how you count sales right here. Yeah. It is 2023 and GitHub still is a monolith. It's still a Rails monolith. Even though we're writing a lot of other languages and deploying a lot of services, when it comes to like actually loading pages on github.com, 100% of the HTML returning traffic is going through a Rails app. Okay. Yeah. We have about 1,400 controllers, and that maps roughly one-to-one models. And what is astounding is that's 25% more controllers than we had this time last year. So even 15 years in, you would think a code base might plateau in its growth. But actually the opposite is true. So I wrote a fun script to check out our code base every month for the past, 14, whatever years. This is, and I just had to count the number of lines of ERB. And this isn't perfect because we write new code other ways. But you can actually see it's getting steeper. Right there, which,
More engineers.
Yeah. But you would think like GitHub is like a fairly mature product, right? Like you would not, I personally would not expect this curve, but here we are. I think it's really important to share this because like, we all work at companies of different sizes. And I think that people at companies like GitHub like to walk around and be like, look what we did, you should do it. Take it or leave it, right? Like if you're at a 5-person company, some of the things I'm talking about might not make sense.
On the same note, though, I just saw a good post on someone who looked at the PostgreSQL Git repo to figure out the maximum commit size that had like made it through review. And it's really interesting, just like, okay, what was the biggest like merge commit that happened for like feature stuff? That'd be another interesting thing to run on this code base too. Like,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
I mean, we're at like, I want to say like 1.8 million commits on our code base.
Oh yeah.
It's massive. Yeah. I was poking around on that the other day. We kind of keep a leaderboard. Yeah.
That one right there is mine. That little for the left, that one.
Yeah.
That one.
Paul's done some time on this code base. Who here has actually worked on it? But you have? Anyone else? Yeah. A lot of people come and gone.
We're going for the open source stuff.
So to understand how accessibility works at GitHub, I think it's important to start with like a little history of GitHub specifically because GitHub is a very weird company, or more specifically was. a weird company, was more weird. It's less weird now. So for the first 6 years, GitHub had no managers. And if you went to our headquarters, this is what the entrance to the headquarters looked like. And it was like a fairly good replica of the Oval Office. The
That was
giant,
the third one.
That was the third office.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. This is, but like in this era.
Or
And
2.0.
And specifically, this is what was on the floor. And when everyone asks like, what's weird about working at GitHub, I always show them a picture of this rug. Because it says the United Meritocracy of GitHub. I actually tried to get them to give this to me last week because we shut down our Boulder office and they wouldn't let me have it. I think that they're kind of embarrassed of this.
I thought that rug had been destroyed years ago.
No, it's still there.
Still at the main office?
The one from Boulder, there's one in Boulder.
Oh, there was.
They made a copy in Boulder.
Oh, okay.
So what this really says is that like, you know, for a long time, GitHub was what we call a cooking for chefs company, which is like, there were no managers. There were no managers for like 6 or 7 years. There was no product managers for like, what, 3 years after that? It was like, it was even longer. And that was because like, the mindset working at GitHub was that we were the customer. We knew what we wanted. We could just build whatever we wanted and like other developers would like it too. And that worked pretty well. We sold for $10 billion. That's great. And I really don't think that like, if we were building software for other people, that approach of no managers and no product would work for as long as it did. As you might imagine, having no empathy in your development process has some real downsides. I know some specific cases where like a customer would come to us and be like, I can actually tell you the feature. It was SAML, but ironically.
Set it up. Knock them down.
The customer, not too many specifics, but they were like, I think it was like a $2 million deal, like pretty early on in the company. It was like a big deal. And they were like, can you just tell us that you will build SAML in the next year? Like, you don't even have to do it now. Like, we'll sign the deal, but just tell us it's on the roadmap. And the official company response is, we don't know if anyone will work on it. Because there was no management of what was actually getting built. It was just whatever people felt like. And because no one wanted to build SAML, we couldn't tell our customer that.
Peter and I were working on that.
Yeah,
And when was it? Was it 2012?
I can tell you, knowing when that deal was, that was like 4 or 5 years later.
Yeah.
That got around.
Yeah. Nobody else was interested in it.
No.
For good reason.
All right.
So I will say, people ask me a lot about like what it was like for Microsoft to buy the company because I joined before we got bought. And one of the things I'll say is that like things have changed along those lines ultimately for the better. And you'll see it like, you know, the way we talk about what we do now, that we want to be the home for everyone, the home for every software developer. And when it comes to disability, to accessibility, we have like a very specific way of thinking about it, which is that like, we want people with disabilities to be able to contribute to human progress. Because we really do believe that like what we all do as software engineers is driving human progress at this point. So giving everyone like that equal opportunity is like to contribute to the future is like really important, especially as, you know, as I was talking about earlier, opportunity in the industry really comes to people who are able to contribute. But these are really big goals. So like I was saying earlier, we have a huge app, big surface area. And as you might imagine, because we are growing this quickly, going through our application that has thousands of pages and just being like, does this work for someone who is blind manually is untenable. Even if we did manually check things, you could imagine that it's like the old adage about the Golden Gate Bridge, right? By the time you're done painting it, you have to start painting it again. We would probably have regressions, and I've seen this happen, that we would fix something and then go fix something else. And by the time we came back to the first thing, it was already broken. Someone had already introduced, you know, something that made it inaccessible. So as you might imagine, to achieve these really lofty goals of making all of GitHub work for people using assistive technology, we need really good tools. So that's kind of the meat of my talk today, is talking about those tools. So the first one is automated accessibility scanning. Has anyone here heard of AXE? Okay, so 3.
You mean
X
Windows? X.
AXE.
Oh, okay. AXE.
So before I get into AXE, if there's nothing you should take away from this talk is that like bad accessibility, it just does not break CI. Like if your CI is passing right now, it says nothing about whether your application is accessible. None of the best practices we have in this industry create accessible experiences, at least from what I've seen. You might trip and fall into a couple, but like nothing that you're doing and have been taught like necessarily will lead you down an accessible path. And even when we do have things that are automatable, like X scanning, they're far from perfect. So like, depending on who you ask, between 30 and 50% of the accessibility issues you will run into in a given page can even be caught with automation. And this is from like a PhD, like research level perspective. Like it is impossible to catch a lot of these things.
Okay.
So I can give an example here. So like, this is one of my favorite ones, is that, so we have an image, right? And you could imagine writing a linter that says, okay, every image needs an alt tag, right? Which just means that someone who can't see is able to have a caption to know what the image was representing to someone who was sighted. So for example, here we have the caption, a cat sitting on a rock. But the problem is that this is a picture of a dog. So being able to check that that caption actually matches the picture is much more difficult. And so you could say you're accessible because you have captions in all your images, but if your captions aren't correct, probably still puts you in like the legal territory where things aren't so good. There's also some more subtle issues too. I have a design background and I got trained in Gestalt techniques, which is where you use the relationships between things to communicate something. So for example, you might put something into columns to communicate that it's two groups of something. Now to a blind user, they can't see those columns, so they don't get that information. What automated tool is going to tell you, oh, you made a pros cons list that was like very clearly delineated in columns, but you didn't do enough to make sure someone with a screen reader could tell that that's what you're doing. That all being said, accessibility scanning can be pretty useful. And like I was saying, the primary one we use and most people in the industry use is called AXE. It's actually AXE. I don't know why the logo doesn't.
Yeah.
Very weird. Anyways, I just for fun ran AXE against the meetup.com website. And as you can see, there are 48 AXE violations, which is not awesome. This is a Chrome DevTools extension you can install. You just click run the whole page and it gives you all the issues. And when you click into them, it tells you what to do. But the most effective thing we've done is you can also run AXE just as JavaScript that you can throw onto a page. So what we do is we turn it on for all of our staff. So when you're using GitHub as a staff member, especially in local development, we just run it. And if there's an AXE warning, we highlight the element that has the violation in bright red. And that helps people fix stuff pretty quick. We actually also run this in, like I said, we run it in production for a lot of staff. Let me say something. We also use it in our end-to-end browser suite. So we run this against like production employees. We don't do this on a ton of stuff, but like, your browser tests, we go through and every time the page changes, and this is in Playwright, for example, you can say, run this function. We basically give it a callback and it just goes through and make sure there's no violations. We also write some custom rules. So for example, you might have a specific accessibility violation you run into. You can use AXE to write a linter, kind of write like you might use Rubicon to get it. So for example, we have tooltips and people were putting links in tooltips, which is really, really inaccessible. So we wrote a linter that said a tooltip should contain text and you don't need to see the code for it. But a big problem we've run into as we roll out this like automated tooling is that like some of these problems are actually intractable. I wish I had better examples of this. Because of the nature of this work, I can't share specific things for legal reasons. But just know that like, as we've dug into this more, what we've been finding is there are some things that actually have to be completely rethought from scratch. Like, it's not like, oh, just add this attribute or like rearrange this HTML. It's like literally like you need to go talk to a designer and a product manager and probably some customers to like find a solution that's going to work. Another thing, there are also things that are really difficult. So for example, like how would you move one of these cards with the keyboard? How would you like resort them with the keyboard? Because these people who are using screen readers, they don't have a mouse. As you can imagine, an automated scanner isn't going to tell you how to make like a drag and drop interface work. Like it might tell you that those cards need better like annotations or something like that, but they're not going to say like, it's not going to be able to detect that you should, add this keyboard interaction or something like that. So that is all to say, making your app AXE clean will make it a lot more accessible. Like if there's anything that you would do in your app based on me ranting to you about this stuff today, set up Axe and see if there's some easy stuff like, your images don't have captions or something like that, but know that like, I wouldn't even consider your app to be accessible. It's almost like not accessible if you use Axe. But it's a really good start, especially if you're going to do some more labor intensive work. Like we have people with disabilities that are consultants that we work with. Their time is really expensive. So we use Axe first to catch the stuff that like is really obvious. And then that saves their time to work on more important things. In fact, that'll probably be my talk for next year is like the manual labor intensive side of accessibility compliance, because that is a whole nother.
Texting Dan now.
Well, yeah. You can put me down and I'll figure it out. Any questions on accessibility scanning?
That first thing with the production, just some internal code you have that does it. Like if you're logged, like the internal users logged in, you see that like
This?
Yeah.
Yeah, just throws a script on the page. I think there's a setting in Axe. You can even change its behavior. Like we have set that as the 3 pixel red border. There's a lot of things you can do. We also instrument it. So if someone sees this, we actually collect that in some telemetry and throw it back to a server.
Just like who didn't fix it. No, I'm just kidding.
No, it's what get your prioritizing what needs to get fixed, basically.
Yeah.
Okay, these are the ones that everyone's seeing every day, so we need to fix these first. Okay, yeah.
And tracking all that, again, that's probably the talk for next year. It's like actually coordinating and tracking all the work around this is just massively difficult.
Just on that front, you might chat with there's somebody local who's just moved over to Mozilla to work on their because they do a lot of grabbing public data from browsers to figure out what to work on next. Stuff.
There's a thing that Chrome does for this. Have you guys heard of this?
Yeah, the Chrome has an accessibility thing that explores it, but I don't know how good it is.
It's like the Google Lighthouse.
Yeah, they take stats on every user's experience of every website, and then you can access that information. But there's some people I work with who are like obsessed with that stuff. So another like really critical thing when we work on accessibility has been forms, like a new way of building forms that we've done. So if you think about it, forms are like really a core competency of Rails. If you go back to the original build a blog in 15 minutes YouTube video, it's basically just like building forms like for 15 minutes and really impressive form building. And I know this is still important because if you go to the Hotwire demo, it's 15 years newer, it's also a lot of form building, just with just forms over WebSockets instead of forms over HTTP. So this is something that I think we can all agree Rails is pretty good at and should be the best at. Like if it's not good at forms, like what are we doing here? And Rails is really great at it. There's a couple built-in helpers. We have form tag and form for. I think they're now technically all inside of form with. Like you can do everything that the other two did in form with. And just to refresh everyone's memory, here's an example I just pulled right out of the Rails guides. And what this example I think makes really painfully obvious is that the Rails form helpers are DOM abstractions. So like these methods, they almost just basically correspond to a tag that is output in the DOM. It simplifies a ton of complexity. It also will sneakily put in like your CSRF token for you so that when you're building a new web app, you don't immediately expose yourself to like, security vulnerabilities like 101. The problem is that this is not accessible out of the box. So if you look at this example code, this was generated by 2 separate method calls where you basically say, I have a label and I have a text field. This example is great because it actually is accessible. Specifically, this passes Axe rule 4.4, which is that anytime you have an input element, you need a label. There you go. So yeah, did you know it's 4.4?
I know it's 4.4. I know that's one of the things.
It needs a label. So for example here, like, we have like our input, we have an ID, and then the label has a for, which says for query. So that links those two things together. And just know that without getting into too much detail, when you're using assistive technology, that combination is what makes it so that someone who is using a screen reader can interact with your form input properly.
Nice. It's also the thing that makes it, if you click the label, it puts the input inside the.
Yeah, exactly. Works for you too. So that's rule 4.4. Programmatically associate labels with all form controls. Recommended method is to use the label element and an explicit association using the for and ID attributes. So our code does this correctly. Rails does it correctly. The problem is that you have to remember to do this. You have to use both of those things. You have to link them up correctly. And as our actual states, you basically have to have this. I don't know if I can say it's 100% of the time, but in our experience building forms at GitHub, it is 100% of the time. But for Rails, it's only an option. You could build an input without a label. So this reminds me of one of my favorite books. I actually saw a copy sitting out there.
Yeah.
I was gonna say, it looks really familiar.
Love this book cover. This is Brooke right here. Yeah, Brooke is the block. When I was working on this talk, I was really reminded of chapter 10, which is titled "Define Errors Out of Existence." Maybe my favorite words in computer programming, which is the idea that like when we're building our software, whenever possible, we should just make it impossible for an error, like a bad thing, to ever happen. Like we should just remove that state from our system. So about a year ago, one of my colleagues and I realized that because we have so many forms to GitHub, hundreds of pages of forms, we needed a way to take this approach to form building where we could take some of these accessibility errors and make it so they never happen. Basically make them accessible by default. So that's where we basically built our custom forms framework. Like that was the instigating idea, was like, what if we were to be able to build forms that pass these Axe rules by default? So we started building a form builder. And if we take our previous example, we basically wrote a DSL. And what it did is it had a single method to create your input fields. And then you provided your label when you created the input, and it was a required argument. It's not rocket science. And under the hood, we just generate both tags, and we link them together. We actually just use secure random.hex because it actually doesn't matter what that ID is. And as an aside, IDs have to be globally unique on a page. Yeah. And it's really easy when you're doing like component-based UI to get duplicate IDs when you're doing this approach. So we actually defer to using secure random hex. We just use like a 6-character version of it to make unique IDs for all of these. So in effect, there's just one example. We made that Axe error impossible.
How do you handle the case where for the visual purposes, the label may need to be styled differently or in some other way, or if it's visually different, or it should be on the top or the right or the left, or are you doing that all with CSS after that, or
we have
some other stuff?
So it is under the hood done with CSS. I think we have some more variants here. I specifically was trying to not make this a sales pitch for our design system.
That's fine. I was like, I've done this before, but not for completely different reasons, because I was like, well, I wanted to make a label be there always, and so I had a whole formula for it.
Yeah,
and all other things, but I wanted it because I wanted a different DOM structure.
So what we ended up having is like Jeremy's asking, is like a couple different variants or options you could pass into the text field. They actually sit at a couple different levels. This is just kind of more broadly a system that codifies the way we like to build forms, which is why I'm not like out here toting it around being like, you should go use this thing, because it's like your form, you're gonna look like you're ripped off GitHub. Like if you use it, right? Like it's not super generally useful.
This is based on the just forgot your design systems.
Yeah, primer.
I was like, it starts with P.
Yeah.
Sorry, there's a comma in the last after label.
Oh, just tell me.
So the diffs.
I made it half
Another line.
half an hour before I get the first. So the thing that this work has really taught us, though, is that like focusing on accessibility has really clarified how we think about designing abstractions. So like you can imagine you go in a room of UI developers and you say, let's build a button. You're going to get 10 different opinions on how to build a button. But if you say, here are the accessibility constraints for building a button, you might get 3 opinions, and they're going to be a much closer agreement because it really clarifies your focus on these things. And I can give a great example of this. So like in our design system, we have this avatar component, and often this avatar is also a link. It's kind of grayed out here, but there's an option where you can like pass in an href. We also tend to use this avatar next to text that also links to a user's profile. And we'd also sometimes use a hover card on both of these items, which got really confusing. But just know that like when someone who's using a screen reader comes across this UI, what often happened is it would read like user Joel Hawksley as like the caption to the picture. And then it would read like Joel Hawksley user as the text for the link, like Joel Hawksley's profile. And for people using assistive technology, this isn't the end of the world, but this is the difference between building something for people with assistive technology versus just accommodating them. duplicate text is actually really annoying and frustrating to people. So we came across that problem and we were like, wait, we could just make a component that is those two things. And that component, we call it the nameplate, contains both the avatar and the text link. And it just makes sure that the interaction of those things and the hover card that you see when you hover over those things is exactly right. And then we, of course, use that component, like any component, we use it, dozens of places across the code base so that anytime someone who's using a screen reader encounters this pattern, it's a very consistent experience for them. Kind of what we see with component-driven UI for people on the visual side too, but always it's going to look the same.
And what does that one end up doing for screen reader? Does it say profile of Joel Hawksley closed this 20 hours ago? I was like, how does the screen reader read that one?
Yeah, it ends up reading it like a sentence. Yeah, like you would see it as a sighted user. I mean, that's ultimately what all this stuff is like anyone who's not sighted, we just want to make it so that they're not at a disadvantage, that they're getting the same information out of the experience that all of us here, I believe, are sighted, are getting out of using GitHub. The last thing I'm going to talk about is what we're calling preview-driven development. So how many of you are familiar with Rails mailer previews? No? Who wants to explain Rails mailer previews? I can. So basically, a preview is a report or something that allows you to preview it in isolation. It's basically a really nice isolated development environment. In this case, like emails are kind of this weird thing. They're like hard to perceive because they aren't actually interactive with in a browser. So preview puts it in a browser so you can look at it. So when we build UI components as a design organization, we write previews for them. And this is specific to the view component gem that I work on, but the code we wrote actually works with any. You can like really render templates of it if you wanted to. So here's an example of a preview. As you can see at the URL, we have a kind of internal path. This is the same kind of paths that the action mailer previews use. So I think it's like Rails mailers, I think is the route path. It's been a while since I've been in our mailers.
I was there today.
Okay, is it Rails mailers?
It is Rails mailers.
Okay. Yeah, so that's Rails mailers. We go Rails view components, and then
You also show like the list of every mailer or every component.
hey, that's 3 slides from now.
Spoilers.
So you can see this is the primer beta version of the button, and it's cut off, but it's the danger version of the button. And this just renders this button in isolation. I made it really big so you can see it. And this is what a preview looks like. This is our specific implementation of it. There are actually a couple other ones, but it kind of looks like a controller. And then it just calls a render call. In this case, it happens to render a view component. This literally could be a render of a template. And when you build a bunch of these on that class, we introspect it and create a list of all of them. So for example, for our button, we have all of these different previews that show it in various forms. What's really cool though, is that we use these in our tests. So we have this helper called render preview. What that does is it takes that preview code and turns it into HTML and injects it straight into Capybara with skipping a browser. So you can write a lot of your traditional browser tests in a more unit test kind of style, and they're super, super fast. I actually talked about this in my first talk 5 years ago. These tests in the GitHub code base are 100 times faster than a controller test. So we were able to convert a ton of our controller-based UI tests into these like just super lean, like basically Capybara node tests. But as you might imagine, some things need to be clicked on. So we also have visit preview, which is just loads that same preview in a browser using Capybara under the hood. So we're able to go in, and I didn't do it here, but you could click on the button and maybe assert that it's a certain focus state or something like that. So what we ended up doing is that we've consolidated all of our test cases to be previews, which means that we write a preview like while designing and developing the component. And then we just use one of those 2 helpers in our test to use the exact same setup to actually write our assertions. Which, like, if you think about it, like, if you take a step back and think about all the Rails apps you've worked on, what your seeds do and what your test setup does, your setup blocks do, they're very similar. So we've effectively done here is just made them the exact same code, which has a ton of really cool benefits, especially at like a bigger code base like we're in. One is that it's really easy to debug your UI tests because like if the test is broken, you can just go look at the preview and you actually have it in your development environment. It's like, you don't have to like throw a debugger in your browser test. You can literally just pull up in Chrome, go to the route and be like, oh, duh, yeah, that thing is missing that, whatever, so we go back to the test of our button. If I misspell that selector, for example, it's just going to fail. And instead of having to go into a browser to like in the debugging process, or like somehow introspect like what got rendered there, I can just go to the preview and inspect it, and I can see that the selector should be -- danger in that case. Another really awesome thing about this is that it's made all of our UI work more discoverable. So you can imagine at our scale, like a fundamental problem is like 2 teams building the exact same thing and not knowing what's going on. So we use a tool called Lookbook, which is basically like Storybook, but specifically built for Rails. It's actually built using Hotwire. It's super slick. And what this does is it effectively creates a direct coupling in between our tests and our documentation. So like now your test cases become your documentation examples that are used throughout the company. And then what that does is it really gives an incentive to write test cases that are interesting to like people who aren't engineers. And it bridges a lot of that like design technical gap. To the point where we've actually stopped building documentation websites. Like if you go to Primer right now, our design system, we have this beautiful documentation site. We're actually working to delete it right now, because all we're going to do is make links to this tool because it's way better and way more dynamic than any documentation site you could build. But perhaps most importantly, when it comes to accessibility, the reason all this is so important is that it creates a way for us to easily render pieces of our user interface in a way that we can then run our accessibility scans against it. Because previously, if you had a template, it would be really hard to like isolate that template and like confidently say like this template is accessible. Now, Lookbook just has an accessibility tab and it actually shows Axe there. We also have a test that just loads every single preview that exists and runs Axe against it and fails automatically. So if you write a preview and it's inaccessible, you don't even make it past CI. So if you think about it, like looking at this tooling, this is one of the reasons why a lot of people switch to React is this kind of workflow. And I think this is, I think 5 years ago, the premise of my talk was the React stuff we're doing is pretty cool. What if Rails could do it? And this is 5 years later, another example of that being true. That has been really great for us. So some of you might have heard of this term in the accessibility practice, and it's called universal design. Has anyone heard of this? I think it's one of the most beautiful things in this study. Universal design is the idea that when you make something accessible, it doesn't just benefit people who are disabled. It benefits everyone. Best example is curb cuts, right? Like this is curb cuts are what make the world accessible to people who use wheelchairs. But they also really benefit people in strollers. And honestly, like I've tripped over a curb. Like I've gotten so used to using curb cuts that that's how much I like them. I think we can learn a lot from this mindset though. So what might universal design look like in software? I kid you not, I did not know that you're talking about SSO.
I was like, oh my God.
So the more you dig into accessibility, you just learn some like really interesting stuff. So like, for example, SSO is actually a very real accessibility accommodation. And my example from the beginning is exactly why. Because if Google already trusts and has authenticated me, you don't need CAPTCHAs with SSO. I just say sign in with Google and I'm good. And it's actually a huge accessibility accommodation, especially for people who have a lot of fraud controls in their sign-up processes, to have SSO as an option to people who are cognitively disabled, for example. Something I learned a lot about, like the login.gov is a good example of this. Like that's one of the reasons they created the login.gov SSO was because like everyone having to, has anyone ever used the Treasury Direct sign-in page? Oh yeah, on screen.
Unsay that. Unsay it.
On screen keyboard, right? Like, but honestly, like before I went through all the bullshit with the fire, I had never even used sign-in with Apple, and now I'm like a convert because like I don't have to use a password manager anymore. I don't have to remember all this stuff. And yes, I know there are downsides. Bro, I'm sure I'll hear from you. But perhaps the bigger lesson here is that accessibility is just like a prototype of this problem, which is that there's a larger class of these kinds of blind spots in the work that we do as I'm gonna call us all wealthy. We all are here in Boulder, so we have some money. We're in the first world. And it reminds me of a quote from someone I don't really like, but a very good quote, which is from Donald Rumsfeld. Yeah, we always know there are known unknowns. That is to say, we know there are some things that we do know, but there are also unknown unknowns, the ones we don't know, And if one looks throughout history, it's the latter category that tends to be the difficult ones. And applying this way of thinking has really opened my mind to other similar potential issues in our practices. So take browser performance, for example. At GitHub, every employee is issued the newest Mac, max RAM, you name it. We click on the dropdown and click the most expensive option, click buy. We're issued the latest cell phone. And these things are bought because a lot of us know in the industry that if you have powerful hardware, you are more productive. You deliver more value. It makes sense to our employers. The problem is that these things give us a very false sense of reality. So, even amongst our customer base that skews towards software developers that generally use more powerful hardware, by requiring every GitHubber to use an iPhone, the experience we're having is not the same as our customers. So, this is from late 2021. This is the phone that GitHub employees are issued, which is the 13 Pro at the time. And this is the best Android phone that you could buy at the same time. Those are their relative performance scores. So the iPhone is 3 times faster than the Android phone. This is a JavaScript benchmark. This is very relevant to what we're working on. That's just one example. Another example is request latency. So a lot of GitHub's data centers are on the East Coast of the United States, and the speed of light matters across the globe. Which means that a lot of our staff is based in the United States. And this is actually something that came up when we were looking at using Hotwire recently, because the latency of using a Hotwire-based app that is served from a data center on the East Coast for someone in Australia is actually really poor.
Yeah, 200 millisecond round trips.
Yeah, it's really poor.
At minimum.
And I can go on and on and on. I mean, another thing is that a lot of our new customers are in in Africa, and we are finding that we say you have a P95 performance measurement. Well, the 5 could be all of your new customers because they're on the slowest hardware in the highest latency region. But because you only care about your P95, you might actually be ignoring a really significant important population. So how do we look out for these blind spots? How do you find unknown unknowns? I mean, if I had an answer to that, I think that I would not be working in GitHub. I'd probably be retired at this point. But I think that kind of what I've shown here is that there are some really practical things we can do from an engineering practices standpoint to embed little tastes of empathy into our process. And it really starts just by putting yourself in the shoes of other people. The more different from you, the better. Thanks.
Friend of mine in Australia, well, he's still in Australia, but he runs a